Welcome everyone. Happy Earth Day. Thank you for joining us for the 5th quarterly update for the South Atlantic Coastal Study. My name is Lindsay Wilson. I'm with CDM Smith and I'm going to be helping facilitate today. So please reach out to either me or Lauren Featherston if you have any technical issues during the presentation. And you can do that by entering your questions into the question box in the control panel. Next, I want to point out a few things before we get started. The lines will be muted during the webinar, but questions and comments can be submitted via the question box throughout the presentation. And then we will bring those up to the panelists when we get to the specified questions and answers times. We will also be recording the webinar today and posting a PDF of the slides to the SACS website. The slides are also available in the handouts section of your control panel. Finally, if you need to minimize this control panel just to get it out of the way and see the screen more clearly, there's an orange arrow on the side here and you can minimize it there. So now we are going to have two quick polls to find out more about who we have on the line today. So in a moment, you will see a screen pop up with the option to select the type of organization you represent. So if you don't fit into one of these categories, feel free to type in your organization into the question box. So we should be seeing that pop up in a second. And again, if we don't have room for another column in this poll, so feel free to type it into the question box if you don't feel like you fit into one of these. We'll give everybody a few seconds to select their answers, and then we can take a look at the results. Okay, I think we can go ahead and close the poll. All right, so it looks like we've got a lot of state and local agency, but we're pretty well represented throughout all the different types. And then it looks like we also have some regional planning councils, waterway commissions, private sector attendees with us today as well. All right, so we can close out of that one and we will move into a second poll. And this one is asking what region you represent. So you should see that pop up in a second. And I apologize that we can't have them more broken out specifically by regions, but we have a limit in the software of how many regions we can put in. So take a minute, make your selection, and then we can look at the results. Okay, I think we can close that now. All right, it looks like we've got a pretty good representation across, not as much from Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, but still pretty well represented across the SACS study area. Okay, we can close out of that. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Pam Cassins, the Regional Project Manager for the South Atlantic Coastal Study.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. As Lindsay's indicated, I am the Regional Project Manager working with our Command Center team and our district teams executing the South Atlantic Coastal Study. So on behalf of our entire study team, I'd really like to welcome you all to our quarterly webinar update. Now, for anybody that might be new to our study, the South Atlantic Coastal Study, known by the acronym SACS, is a 4-year regional effort, federally funded to a budget of $18.4 million. Now, the study is intended to address regional coastal risks to communities and resources that are located within the tidally influenced areas of 6 states, continental United States, from North Carolina to Mississippi, in addition to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Now, it's important to note that the SACs will not be recommending specific projects for congressional authorization, but will be identifying areas of high risk and opportunities to take action to reduce those risks. Now, follow-on actions by our partners and our stakeholders may very well result in new project proposals, but specifically that's not part of the SAC's outputs or the study scope. Now, we always set the stage for these updates with a refresh on our shared vision statement developed at the study outset in collaboration with you and all the folks on this webinar, all the folks that have been participating with us to date and coordinating with us, collaborating with us to date. Now, the shared vision statement serves to focus our team on what we're trying to achieve through our study products and recommendations, which really at the end of the day is a common understanding of the risks that we all face throughout the entire study area, from coastal flooding, coastal storm damage, and sea level rise, and the development of integrated strategies to manage those risks and enhance community resilience by essentially being better prepared to meet the challenges of climate change and the future in general. Next slide, please. So we use these webinars really as a means to provide you with regular status updates on study progress every few months. Our last meeting with you was held back in January of this year, and our team's focus since we turned the calendar year really has been moving away from an intensive series of field meetings, focus area action strategy meetings, to technical product finalization and report development and refinement of study recommendations. So as we bear down on drafting our report products, we've really decided to use these quarterly webinars as an opportunity to give you a quick study update and offer you really a deeper dive into one of our technical report products that are going to be made available to you this year for your use. So after a really quick study progress overview, Christina May, who's our environmental team lead, is going to be focusing today on the environmental technical report, covering vulnerability and risk to environmental resources throughout the study area, which was part of our direction from Congress. So we want to hear from you. Please, as Lindsay mentioned, please go ahead and use the chat function to offer up your questions as we move through the agenda, and we'll periodically be able to pause for Q&A as we move along. Next slide, please. So our study team consists of a regional command center team comprised of subject matter experts sitting in different districts within the Corps' South Atlantic Division. Our 8 state and territory appendices are being executed by 5 district teams led by district project managers. So Christina works really closely with the environmental subject matter experts in each district. And the folks that are going to be presenting to you today are identified in italics on this slide. So the final slide in this presentation will contain the email contact information for all of us. So please feel free, once this presentation wraps up, once the webinar and the Q&A wraps up today, to reach out to any or all of us for follow-up questions or comments. Next slide, please. So this slide really illustrates where we are in the overall study timeline. The 4-year study time clock started ticking in August of 2018 when we received our initial funding allotment, and we're scheduled to wrap up with final report approval and transmittal to headquarters in August of next year, 2022. Most of this past calendar year, as I mentioned, would be focused on executing the 63 focus area action strategy workshops and developing a series of technical report products in addition to recommendations that comprise those risk reduction strategies. The takeaway really just from this chart here is that we are about 2/3 of the way through the study, and we're moving towards issuing our draft report package in October of this year. So you will all have an opportunity to take a look at that draft report and provide us with your feedback when it's posted in October for a 45-day review period. So just to clarify, the study's not recommending specific projects for authorization. Because of that, there's no NEPA compliance documentation associated with the study. So there's no magic associated with the 45-day review period. We just wanted to make sure that the package was on the street long enough for everyone to take a look and provide their feedback. Next slide, please. So many of you will have already seen this key products placemat, which provides really an overview of SACS report products that are either available already or will be in the near future. The measures and cost library, the Tier 2 economic risk assessment, and the environmental technical report will be available when they're finalized this year. Our GeoPortal went live to the public a couple of months ago, and through that GeoPortal, you can access the risk assessment, the sand availability and needs determination products, the regional sediment management optimization report, and the Fish and Wildlife Service Planning Aid report. You can also access those products via the SACS webpage. And I think Lindsay has got the links to both the GeoPortal and the webpage in the chat. So today we're highlighting the reports, the products that are circled in red. If you've got a particular interest in any of the other products on the slide, please let us know. We're going to do our best to showcase technical products, as I mentioned, in upcoming quarterly webinars. So our next webinar quarterly update will be in July. I think we're going to be showcasing the coastal hazard system, updated wave and water level statistics and data. But please, we want to hear from you in terms of products that you have a particular interest in. So at this point, I guess I'm going to turn the mic over to Lisa Clark to give you just kind of an overall update on our outreach program. Lisa.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Pam. I appreciate that. And good afternoon, everyone. As Pam said, I am Lisa Clark, the outreach lead for the South Atlantic Coastal Study. And taking a look at this chart here, the pie chart on the top left is a breakdown of the more than 1,400 plus stakeholders that we have throughout the study area. We want to say thank you for your continued support and tell you how much we appreciate you, our stakeholders who take the time to attend our webinars and participate in our workshops. The outreach and communication strategy, part of it is our newsletter distribution. We continue to create and distribute our newsletters, which provide information on what the command team and district teams have been working on and other study product updates. You will find past issues on our website and can always email at sac@usace.army.mil to get your copy today. Our first edition was published in 30 January 2020. We had 10 editions in 2020, and our latest and greatest is out there on the website right now, as I mentioned, and we are currently working on our next issue. And finally, do you have copyrighted photos? We are looking for photos for the report. Good photos that you or your agency or associated group has rights to publish or that are public domain. Photos should capture the focus of SACS, which is to provide a common understanding of risk from coastal storms and sea level rise to support resilient communities and habitats. We're looking for photos that depict property, assets, infrastructure, environmental resources, and cultural resources in oceanfront, back bay, and tidally influenced riverine settings during storm events or during non-storm events. And then, of course, any other photos that you feel align with the intent of SACS are also welcome. What I would ask you to do is to please reach out at sacs@usace.army.mil if you need any further clarification or if you think you already have photos that would be a good fit. And with that, I'm going to say thank you and turn it over to Ms. Christina May. Christina?
Thank you, Lisa, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christina May, and I'm the environmental lead on the South Atlantic Coastal Study, and I work in the Baltimore District Corps Office. I will be presenting the SACS environmental products along with two of the other environmental team members, Bethany Ward and Kat McConnell. Next slide, please. So the focus of this quarterly webinar is on the SACS environmental products. And one of the products is the SACS Environmental Technical Report, and that includes the environmental resources vulnerability and risk analysis, as well as the identification of priority environmental areas. Another product is the Environmental Analysis Story Map, and that is a GIS web mapping application, which is a companion to the Environmental Technical Report. So in this presentation, we're going to give a brief description of these products, explain why these products were developed, and we're going to give you an overview of each of these products, including the methods, findings, how these products were used in the study, and how stakeholders can use this information. Next slide, please. So this slide lists the main components of each product. The Environmental Technical Report describes the methodology used to identify vulnerable and at-risk environmental resources. It provides the findings of the vulnerability and risk analysis. And the report also describes the criteria used to identify the priority environmental areas. The report also includes a section on stakeholder coordination, and it includes 5 appendices. And we're going to talk about the content of these appendices as we go through the presentation. So in the story map, I mentioned earlier, it's a GIS web mapping application. It includes the following components: the story map, the environmental dashboard, environmental web app, and the methodology tab. And you'll see on this slide, we did put it in the chat box. This is the link to the SACS webpage. And on this webpage includes a link to the GeoPortal. And I just suggest here to open the GeoPortal in Google Chrome so you can kind of get the best performance out of the GeoPortal. So right now I'm going to actually go through the SACS website and open up the GeoPortal and kind of show you the environmental analysis story map. All right, can you see my screen there?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay. So this is the SACS webpage. And if you go down to on the right-hand side is a GeoPortal section. Click here. And this will take you to the SACS GeoPortal page. So this just includes all the geospatial data and the products for the study. So this is the SACS data. If you scroll down and you can select between any of this data, and then we're going to scroll down to geospatial products. And as Pam mentioned, here's a link to the Tier 1 risk assessment, the Tier 2 economic risk assessment, the sand availability needs determination. We also have a couple products that are still in the works, but they will be available soon on this webpage. But for today's webinar, we're going to go to the environmental analysis GeoPortal. So we're going to click on environmental analysis, and it will take us to the SACS environmental analysis GeoPortal page. So here's a little description on the SACS environmental analysis. And here are 2 maps, the environmental analysis story map, which we're going to run through. We also have a priority environmental areas map. And then this is just if you want to go right into the map and look at the priority environmental areas, you don't have to go through the story map. The priority environmental areas layer is in the story map, but if you just want to quickly go to see the priority environmental areas, they're right here in this map. So we are going to click on environmental analysis story map. And we're going to let that load for a second. All right. So you will see up here at the top, we've got the 4 tabs: story map, SACS environmental dashboard, environmental web app, and methodology. So the story map tab, this provides a high-level overview of the SACS environmental resources vulnerability and risk analysis. So if you scroll through, this gives you an overview accompanied by screenshots of the various maps from the analysis. So I'll go through here. I'm not going to explain this, but I just wanted to give you kind of an overview of what this tab is. The SACS Environmental Dashboard. This tab shows 4 side-by-side maps that offer a comprehensive view of the data on one screen. And we'll be talking about all of these maps, as we go through our presentation. But, if you zoom in to one location, all of the maps will zoom in at the same time. So it kind of gives you that comprehensive look of all the data on one screen. The SACS Environmental Web App, this kind of takes a little bit to load, but I'm just going to say that this tab includes various data layers that can be toggled on and off. It includes the vulnerability analysis, the risk analysis, the priority environmental areas, CCAP data, which Bethany is going to talk about, U.S. Fish and Wildlife critical habitat data, and other data layers. So here we go. We can click on the layers right here. And here's all the layers that can be kind of clicked on it, toggled on and off to see the different data. And then the methodology tab. So this tab has a document which gives kind of a little more detail on the steps of the environmental resources vulnerability and risk analysis. And this is actually being updated right now. So if you don't want to read through the entire environmental technical report, you can go to this methodology document just to kind of get a more high-level overview of the steps of the methodology. There's also the vulnerability scores, which Bethany is going to talk about in a little more detail. Those scores are also in this tab. All right, so we can go back to the presentation. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so why were these products developed as part of SACS? So the authority for SACS is found in Section 1204 of the Water Resources Development Act of 2016. And the authority directs USACE to conduct a study of the coastal areas located in the geographical boundaries of the South Atlantic Division to identify risks and vulnerabilities of those areas to increased hurricane and storm damage as a result of sea level rise. I wanted to specifically point out Part 4B of the authority, which requires the study to develop a long-term strategy to address increased hurricane and storm damages that result from rising sea levels and identify opportunities to enhance resiliency, increase sustainability, and lower risks in populated areas, areas of concentrated economic development, and areas with vulnerable environmental resources. So in order to kind of meet the intent of what Congress wanted us to do to identify opportunities in areas with vulnerable environmental resources, that is why we did an assessment to look at the vulnerability and risk of environmental resources. Next slide, please. The environmental vulnerability risk analysis is also consistent with the SACS objectives. It assessed the vulnerability and potential risk of environmental resources to increased hurricane and storm damages as a result of sea level rise. It supports the identification of problems and opportunities affecting the resiliency of vulnerable environmental resources. The results of the analysis were used to identify planning reach-specific opportunities to reduce risk and enhance the resiliency of at-risk environmental resources through a range of potential measures. These opportunities were used to formulate specific and detailed actions to address risk. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to show the steps of the vulnerability and risk analysis, the methodology we used. So step 1, we defined vulnerable environmental resources. Step 2, we identified the exposure elements, which I'll talk about on the next slide. Step 3, identify vulnerable environmental resources. And that's what Bethany is going to be talking to you about. Step 4, identify environmental resources at risk. And then step 5 is to identify the priority environmental areas. And Kat McConnell will be talking to you about step 4 and step 5. Next slide, please. So step 1, define vulnerable environmental resources. So vulnerable environmental resources is really a broad term. So we wanted to kind of narrow it down for our study. So what we came up with was, for the South Atlantic Coastal Study, vulnerable environmental resources are those natural areas or features that may be adversely affected by exposure to sea level rise or storm surge. So I'm not going to read the whole definition, but I just wanted to point out that we did define vulnerable environmental resources as natural areas. And for the purposes of SACS, a natural area is defined as a physical area which either retained or has reestablished its natural character, although it need not be completely undisturbed, and which typifies native vegetation and associated biological and geological features. Next slide, please. So step 2, identify our exposure elements. So step 2, exposure is defined as who or what may be harmed by the hazard. So in the previous slide, vulnerable environmental resources were defined for SACS as natural areas. The team identified the exposure elements to be the natural area types that may be exposed to coastal storm hazards. Natural area types are defined in this analysis as upland forested and non-forested communities, freshwater forested and non-forested wetlands, estuarine wetlands, beaches, riverine communities, and nearshore marine communities. So each biologist on the SACS environmental team identified the types of natural areas in their particular state or territory. Identification of the natural area types was based on state and territory natural area inventories and data, such as the North Carolina Natural Heritage Data Explorer and the Florida Natural Areas Inventory. So in Appendix A of the Environmental Technical Report, there is a table that lists all the natural area types and provides a description of those natural areas, as well as, the protected species that that natural area could support, as well as any critical habitat in that area. There's a separate table for each state and territory, and that is located in Appendix A of the Environmental Technical Report. Next slide, please. So are there any questions so far?
Yes, we have had a few questions come in. The first one was more of a general question from the introductory slides, asking whether it's too late to have an area of need added to the sand.
Okay, Lindsay, I can quickly take that. The sand technical report at this time is a final report, but the overall SACS clearly is not. So what I would recommend is that you reach out to us. Clay McCoy is our Regional Sediment Management Command Center team member. He's in charge of the overall sand products. Or you can reach out to me or send in your information through the SACS email, and we'll take a look at it and we'll find a way to work that in. If it can't get into the sand report itself, we'll find a way to work that in, obviously, into our overall report itself. So, so please, yeah, send in the information that you've got, and we'll go from there.
Great, thank you, Pam. Another question we had, when looking at the environmental resources and vulnerability map, particularly around the Charlotte Harbor, there are low and medium risk bands along the coast, and then higher risk further inland. So the question is this, if this is in response to sea level rise and storm surge, how could those outer areas be at less risk than the areas further inland?
So I'll answer that. So Bethany is going to talk about how we assessed vulnerability to environmental resources. We assessed the different natural areas to storm surge inundation, erosion, wind, and saltwater intrusion from sea level rise. We did kind of a scoring assessment. So you may get an answer to your question once she goes through that analysis.
Great, thank you. We've had a couple people asking about, we've tried to post the link to this in the chat and it seems like it's not coming through for everybody in the chat. So we can try again, and we can follow up with links to the tool afterward.
Okay.
And I think that's all we have for questions right now. So we can keep moving, and if anyone comes up with a question related to that first section, feel free to put it in the question box and we can bring it back up in the next round of questions.
Sounds good.
Lindsay, this is Pam. Let me quickly ask Lisa Clark, our outreach lead. Lisa, are those links on our webpage? Is the link to the GeoPortal and on the webpage?
Yes, they are. And actually, I'm getting ready to paste it into the chat, as well as it's best viewed in Google Chrome, Firefox, Mozilla Firefox, I think. So not Internet Explorer. Let me see if I can go ahead and paste it there, but it is in fact on our website as well, yes.
Okay, I think also on your slide, there may be a link to the web page.
Yes, there is. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I mean, just kind of for everybody, if you can't see that link in the chat, on Lisa's pie chart slide, there is a link to the SACS webpage. You can actually get to all those links as well through that webpage on the bottom right.
Right here. And I'll leave that open for a minute because it looks like we have another question that just came in. Do we have examples of an agency or an institution or project making use of this portal or these resources yet? What do you anticipate are the best uses of this?
That is going to be actually explained at the very end of the presentation. But the priority environmental areas that we identified, those can be considered by stakeholders if they're looking at areas to conserve or manage or do some sort of environmental resource restoration or anything. But that will kind of be explained at the end of the presentation, how stakeholders will be able to use these products. To my knowledge, I don't know if these products, only the GeoPortal is available to the public right now. The environmental report is not available yet. It will be available this summer. To my knowledge, nobody has used that product yet, but it was used during the SACS Focus Area Action Strategy workshops to kind of identify those focus area boundaries and actions in the focus areas. So I hope that answers the question.
Christina, I also kind of backing you up on that as well. This is Pam Castens. The Corps of Engineers teams throughout all 5 districts are actively using the information and the data in the GeoPortal from all the completed SACS products to date and the geospatial data to date. So all that information is being leveraged in other planning studies across the entire South Atlantic Division area of responsibility. We've had a lot of interest in that GeoPortal. Trevor Lancaster, our geospatial lead, has fielded a lot of questions on that. So So it is being used. I can speak more to our internal use, but as Christina mentioned, as the report products get finalized, get posted, I think that we're going to see a much broader application. And I know Christina and her team will go into some of those specifics on what those applications are in a few minutes.
Great, thanks, Pam. It looks like that's it for questions right now, so I will move on to the next slide.
Okay, and I would like to pass it on to Bethany Ward to talk about the vulnerability analysis.
Hi, everybody. I'm Bethany Ward. Quick sound check. Can you hear me? And someone can just confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So we have still have a lot more slides to go. The presentation's not over yet, so we're just trying to stop along the way to ask, pause to ask questions on what you've heard so far. And I think these next sections of the presentation will help answer some of the questions that we weren't able to fully address earlier. So I'm Bethany Ward, and I'm a biologist with the Charleston District, and I'm part of the SACS environmental team. And over those next few slides, I'm going to talk about the vulnerability analysis that we performed for the natural areas. So after we identified the exposure elements in the SACS study area, we wanted to assess whether the natural areas are actually vulnerable to adverse impacts, because some natural areas may be more susceptible than others, and some natural areas may provide protection against these hazards. And the coastal storm hazards that we evaluated were storm surge inundation, erosion, wind, and saltwater intrusion from sea level rise. The SACS environmental team's goal for the vulnerability analysis was to have a consistent methodology for assessing vulnerability of the natural areas across the SACS study area. And be able to spatially display and map these results. We also wanted to assess the vulnerability irrespective of the likelihood of exposure to storms. That would come later when we do the risk assessment. So we did both a vulnerability assessment, and then we included the exposure, and then we did a risk assessment. So there's a difference between the vulnerability assessment and the risk assessment. To help achieve consistency, the team decided to use NOAA's Regional Land Cover Classification Scheme from their Coastal Change Analysis Program, or CCAP, that's the acronym that's used. And we use this as the land cover data set that would represent the types of natural areas that are found across the entire study area. This was chosen for the vulnerability analysis because the data are focused specifically on the coastal zone, and it was available for the entire study area. And it's also derived from remote sensing data with methods that have been proven to be consistent and accurate. And these mapped classes and how they change over time can be considered important indicators of coastal ecosystems. However, the NOAA CCAP classes are often broader or less specific than the natural areas or habitats that are mapped at the state or local level. So the SACS environmental team worked collectively to identify the most appropriate NOAA CCAP classes that best characterize each natural area type that's found in our states. Next slide. So the team evaluated the vulnerability of each natural area type or CCAP class to each of the hazards, the storm surge inundation, erosion, wind, and saltwater intrusion from sea level rise that I mentioned before. The team used criteria like that shown here on the screen to develop the vulnerability of the natural areas, to determine the vulnerability of the natural areas to each hazard. And to inform our evaluation, the team used scientific literature, information from federal and state agencies, the descriptions of the CCAP classes themselves, and best professional judgment to apply the criteria. However, evaluation of some of the effects were beyond the scope of this study. For example, we didn't consider the specific thresholds that may influence vulnerability of, let's say, a salt marsh system, of when it's exposed to a storm before it actually realizes effects. And there are so many other factors that play into that, like the quality of the system before it's exposed, the soil permeability, the specific plant species tolerance, et cetera. And those are very site-specific criteria. And at this stage in the SAC study, we're not looking at site-specific evaluation. Next slide. So this slide shows you an excerpt from one of the vulnerability tables that was produced for the analysis. For the vulnerability analysis, the team provided both a description of the vulnerability of each class to the hazard, as shown here in the middle columns, and we also associated a numerical score with each of the CCAP classes so that the vulnerability could be mapped and visually displayed. SAC's environmental team, with the assistance of our GIS lead, developed a scoring system to rate the vulnerability of each CCAP class to the hazard. And we used a score of 1, 2, or 3 to assign for each hazard, with 1 indicating a low vulnerability, 2 moderate vulnerability, and a score of 3 indicated high vulnerability. The vulnerability scores of each hazard were then totaled per class, and the team developed a formula to classify the overall vulnerability of each class to storm surge and sea level rise hazards. I won't go into all of the details of the scoring formula, but essentially the storm surge, inundation, erosion, and saltwater intrusion from sea level rise were given more weight than wind, because wind has less influence on long-term effects such as sea level rise. And based on the weighting formulas, the total vulnerability scores of each CCAP class were then translated to low, medium, or high vulnerability, shown in the last column of the vulnerability tables. And we created vulnerability tables for each state and territory. Next slide. So this table shows the total vulnerability scores of each CCAP class for each state and territory. And it's color-coded by the low, medium, high classifications based on the formula that I spoke about earlier. You can see by looking at the table that there are some trends in the vulnerability results. For example, the estuarine wetlands generally had a lower vulnerability than the palustrine wetlands and upland classes when using our methods. You can also see that there is some consistency in the scoring while still recognizing some local differences. So for example, there are some similarities geographically in the scoring for North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, and similarities in the scoring for the Gulf states and the territories. Next slide. So now I just wanted to give you a quick overview of how the environmental resources vulnerability map was developed and how the vulnerability scoring was incorporated into the online story map. So first we used NOAA's Category 5 maximum of maximum / inundation layer, and we overlaid that with the NOAA CCAP data layer to identify and isolate the extent of the CCAP classes to use. The CCAP land cover classes were then classified to the vulnerability scores of 1, 2, and 3, and then we symbolized them into the 3 classes of green for low or a score of 1, orange was medium or a score of 2, and red for high 3. And at this time, we would like to go back into that story map to show you and walk you through a little bit of that vulnerability map and what that looks like. So I think Christina's going to pull that up.
Okay, so we are back in the environmental geoportal. We're in the SAC's environmental dashboard tab, and you can see on the top of the dashboard is the NOAA CCAP class map that Bethany talked about, as well as the vulnerability map that's on the right side here. So according to these 2 maps, it looks like estuarine emergent wetlands, according to our scoring and our vulnerability analysis, scored as a medium vulnerability. Estuarine scrub-shrub wetlands looks like they scored as having a low vulnerability. And this is, just wanted to mention, this is Port Canaveral in Florida. And it looks like high vulnerability were palustrian forested wetlands. So again, just like Bethany mentioned, this does not take into account exposure or location. Location will come into play when we talk about the risk analysis. So I know somebody had that question of why, estuarine emergent wetlands don't have as much risk as the wetlands on the interior. That is why. So we didn't look at location specifically in the vulnerability analysis. That went into play in the risk analysis. Also, we'll go over here to the environmental web app tab. And let's see, environmental resources vulnerability is right here. So if you want to just look at the full map by itself, you can do that in the web app. All right, now back to the presentation.
All right, thanks, Christina. So just to wrap up my portion, the findings from the vulnerability analysis are also summarized in the environmental technical report, but I'll just go over a few of the highlights and you'll be able to explore these inside the tool. Generally, our unconsolidated shore communities, these would be our beach and dune habitats, scored as highly vulnerable to coastal storms and sea level rise. Our forested and forested wetlands scored as moderately to highly vulnerable. Our grass and herbaceous communities were moderately vulnerable. And our estuarine wetlands have a moderate to low vulnerability, which might make sense if you consider that these kinds of resources in our estuaries are already somewhat adapted to seeing variations in conditions. That concludes my portion, and I think we're going to take a few questions at this time on the vulnerability analysis before we move into the risk assessment.
Yes.
Any of my colleagues that are from the environmental team are welcome to jump in and help.
Thank you, Bethany. Yeah, so we had, the first question was really just about the CCAP data that was used. And we have had our GIS lead has said that the 2016 CCAP data was used in the analysis. The 2010 CCAP data is the latest published or available map service, but with the discussion, in discussion with the CCAP team, they indicated that they will be updating their map services in the near future. So those should be available. But the CCAP data in this was 2016. And then we've had some other questions. Let's see here. One was, given that Florida has varied barrier island systems, some functional while others not, how did the vulnerability analysis take into consideration those types of variations?
Hey, Darren, if you're on, do you want to take a stab at that since you did Florida?
Sorry, let me see.
Bethany, this is
Yep.
Kat McConnell, and
Oh, Kat, you might have done that as well. Go ahead.
Right, part of my district covers the panhandle of Florida, and we have some barrier islands in along the panhandle. What we looked at, again, using the system that, the methodology that's been presented to you already, we looked at what those resources were that were that could be exposed or what's in harm's way, and then from that we determined what they're in looking at what those resources could have resilience and adaptation to for different types of hazards such as erosion and wind, and not so much salt water intrusion, but just storm surge was a big one. So looking at these outer islands as first defense of coastal barrier, were they able to adapt, or would they be totally inundated like with sea level rise? And then from looking at those factors, and then coupling them up with the risk, that was pretty much how we addressed it. But again, when we were looking at these vulnerabilities early on, we did not look at the specific locations. That risk factor takes in the location by coupling it with the hazard as well as the vulnerability.
Hi, this is Darren. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
can.
I just add that, you know, as you move, you know, from north to south in the state, you know, there's more mangroves to the south, obviously, and you know, and they're very important to the ecosystem. So in the write-up that in the environmental report, we talk about that. While they were ranked lower because they do have the ability to migrate, you know, we did identify that it's an important resource. You know, and the northern part of the state has more salt marsh, Spartina type dominant areas on some of the barrier islands, and you know, we rank that as medium vulnerability. So you know, we took, you know, regional ecology in account moving through the state on the barrier islands. Over.
Great, thank you, Darren. And I think we're getting a couple questions that are still a little bit confused about the difference between the vulnerability mapping and the risk mapping and how locations are incorporated in. And I think maybe just one more explanation of that difference and why, you know, why certain habitats are listed as not as vulnerable when they might be actually higher risk.
So I might suggest that we move through the risk assessment part of the presentation, and then we can revisit that after the risk assessment presentation, because I think that might help. Hopefully that will help clarify. And if it hasn't, then we need to do some additional explanation and make sure we translate that better into the technical report. But I would maybe suggest we move through that part of the presentation, which is what's up next. And Kat's going to cover that. Hopefully it's agreeable with our participants.
I think that's a good idea. And then we can kind of circle back to some of these questions as needed.
Great, thanks. And so now I'm going to pass it on to Kat McConnell, who was you heard just briefly before, and she's going to talk about the risk assessment.
Thank you. Again, I'm Kat McConnell, and I am the Mobile District Environmental Lead for SACS, and I'm here to discuss risk and the development of priority environmental areas. So to determine environmental risk, the vulnerability indices were multiplied by the hazard. Risk is the combination of the vulnerability of the CCAP class and the probability of the hazard occurring. The hazard used to determine risk was storm surge inundation and sea level rise. The combined hazard plus sea level rise data set from the SACS Tier 1 risk assessment was used to depict this hazard. It was applied because the data was available for the entire study area. The hazard index includes the following 3 water level scenarios. First, the 10% annual chance water levels from the USACE Engineering Research and Development Center statistical analysis of tide gauge data. Second, the 1% annual chance water levels from the FEMA flood hazard layer. And third, the Category 5 maximum of maximums from NOAA National Storm Surge Hazard Maps. 3 feet of sea level rise was added to the 1% and 10% annual chance flood hazard layers to simulate future flooding given the 3 feet of relative sea level rise for the 10-year and 100-year coastal storm. The potential risk areas were binned into the 3 classes of high, medium, and low. And the map of this slide is Northeast Florida, shows the high, medium, and low risk areas depicted as red, yellow, and green, respectively. Okay, so now I will hand this off to Christina, who is going to walk you through this risk in the GeoPortal. Christina?
All right. Okay. Okay. Can you see the GeoPortal?
Yes.
Okay. So we're in the dashboard again. And the bottom shows the combined hazard that Kat just talked about plus, oh, sorry, plus the 3 feet of sea level rise. And this is our hazard. When you expose the vulnerable areas to the hazard, that is when you get your areas at risk. And that is shown here on the bottom right. We see estuarine emergent wetlands have a vulnerability of medium. And when those wetlands are exposed to the hazard, they continue to have that kind of moderate risk. And then again, going into the web app, we have, let's see, I'll turn off vulnerability, and here is our risk map. If you want to just look at the risk in one map, and you can kind of zoom in locations. So I hope that helped kind of describe how, you know, when the vulnerable areas are exposed to the hazard, then we get the risk. Hope that the maps kind of show that. But if not, we can kind of discuss it later on. All right, back to the presentation.
Okay, thank you. Now I will present the inundation risk analysis regional findings. Deciduous forests are highly vulnerable to the hazard of inundation by storm surge and sea level rise. Although they are vulnerable to this hazard, they are less exposed than other land cover classes that are adjacent to the coast. When vulnerability indices are multiplied by that hazard, deciduous forests are generally at low risk in the mapped footprint. Estuarine emergent wetlands are at medium to low risk, but with the vulnerability indices factored in, the risk rises slightly to medium, and that's from storm surge inundation and sea level rise. Estuarine marsh and other natural areas along the coast of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia range from low to medium risk. Plustrian wetlands, whether forested, scrub shrub, herbaceous, are at high risk to inundation hazard in Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi. In Alabama, plustrian forested wetlands are highly vulnerable to prolonged or permanent flooding by saline rich waters. When vulnerability indices are multiplied by the hazard, the risk levels go to high, especially in the Mobile-Tensas River Delta. Detailed information of the regional findings can be found in the SACS Environmental Tech Report in section 2.4.1. Next slide, please. This data led to the identification of the priority environmental areas. Priority environmental areas, or PEAs, are a subject of the medium and high risk areas that were identified during the SACS Environmental Resources Inundation Risk Analyses. PEAs support priority biological resources as described in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or FWS, SACS Planning Aid Report, or PAR. These include federally listed threatened and endangered species, waterbird nesting colonies, breeding and wintering shorebirds, or other managed species. They are considered high priorities by stakeholders such as state and federal agencies and non-governmental organizations or NGOs. PEAs can include managed lands such as Endangered Species Act designated critical habitats, FWS National Wildlife Refuges, Audubon Important Bird Areas, State Heritage Preserves and Wildlife Management Areas, and national and state areas of environmental or cultural significance. The PEAs were selected from the SACS Environmental Resources Risk Inundation Analysis Map by considering filters like, is a portion of the area at moderate or high risk of coastal storm surge inundation and sea level rise? For example, the Cumberland Island National Seashore in Georgia includes palustrine forested wetlands, which are at high risk, estuarine emergent wetlands at moderate risk, and estuarine evergreen forested wetlands at low risk. Does the area support priority wildlife and plant species described as priority biological resources in the FWS-PAR? These include federally protected species such as birds, mammals, and sea turtles, fresh or marine aquatic species, reptiles and plants, as well as migratory bird suitable habitat and other managed species like bald eagles and essential fish habitat. Is the area identified as a priority by the state or territory or other federal agencies or NGOs? Examples include the ESA designated critical habitats or national wildlife refuges, USDA national forests, state parks, Audubon bird sanctuaries, state heritage preserves and wildlife management areas, national and state areas of environmental or cultural significance, and otherwise protected natural conservation areas. Finally, does the area consider other goods and services provided by the ecosystem? Examples of these services include recreation, tourism, aesthetics, cultural and educational support, and commercial activities such as logging, fisheries, or shellfish production, and the protection of property and infrastructure. A total of 288 priority environmental areas were identified throughout the entire SACS study area. The purpose of the PEAs is to identify natural areas with vulnerable resources that are at risk to the hazard posed by storm surge inundation and sea level rise. These areas can be targeted by stakeholders for planning as potential candidates for protection, conservation, and/or land use management. Designation as a PEA by USACE does not create a special legal protection or status of the area, nor does it change how the area is regulated under federal or state laws. Now, Christina is going to show you an example of the PEA map in the GeoPortal. Thank you, Christina.
Okay, thank you, Kat. So we are in the SACS Environmental Web App tab, and I've clicked on the layer here, Priority Environmental Areas. So these are the boundaries shown here in green of the priority environmental areas. And the boundaries of these priority environmental areas, existing stakeholder data was used, including the USGS protected area database, and the parcel data was used to map the boundaries of these priority environmental areas. While our team could have created our own areas geographically, it is important to utilize existing authoritative data where possible, so that the boundaries of these PEAs kind of have some underlying support. So that's why we did that. So if you click on here, this is a priority environmental area, Ace River Basin, National Estuarine Research Reserve. It just kind of gives a very little description. This is in South Carolina in the SACS Planning Reach 4. More descriptive information on these priority environmental areas is found in the Environmental Technical Report. Appendix C of the report is going to have a description of every priority environmental area and why it was identified as a priority. So back to the presentation. .
Next slide, please. So the Ashapu-Combahee-Edisto, or ACE Basin National Estuarine Research Reserve, NERR, is located in South Carolina. And the ACE Basin is a great example of a priority environmental area because it meets the criteria that was previously discussed. The ACE Basin NERR spans a large area of mostly undeveloped coastline between Charleston and Hilton Head that is relatively pristine, with various natural areas including beach and dune, maritime forests, and riparian wetlands and forests associated with tidally influenced rivers. It encompasses managed lands by NOAA and the FWS, state managed lands including state parks, wildlife management areas, heritage preserve sites, and private protected lands. It provides quality habitat for fish and wildlife species, including ESA critical habitat, and for T&E species such as piping plover and Atlantic sturgeon. The site provides recreation, research, and educational opportunities, and contains cultural resources of both historic and prehistoric significance. Within the ACE Basin, beach and dune coastal systems are at high risk of erosion from inundation, with potential loss of habitat for nesting sea turtles and many species of shorebirds. Other remaining resources are at medium to high risk, with potential loss of habitat for multiple species of birds, reptiles, or other wildlife, and the potential loss of significant cultural resources from erosion. While most of the ACE Basin is already in conservation status, its location along the Atlantic Ocean makes the frontage and tidal rivers a prime candidate for management techniques to address storm risk, such as natural and nature-based features that promote ecological resilience. Next slide, please. In Alabama, the Mobile-Tensaw River Delta is an extensive freshwater riverine wetland system that's located at the northern limit of Mobile Bay. Multiple river and stream channels converge in the delta to form a unique complex that supports unfragmented uplands and freshwater wetlands. The delta is an FWS designated significant habitat unit and is also an Alabama designated Gulf Ecological Management, or GEM site. Its diversity of features includes mature bald cypress swamp, mixed hardwood forested wetlands, herbaceous marshes, and cultural resources. It provides habitat for hundreds of species of insects, birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and vegetation, many of which are federally or state protected. The most important resource in the Mobile-Tensaw River Delta is water quality. The extensive complex of wetlands within the delta are dependent on a balance of fresh and brackish waters by tidal influence from Mobile Bay. The delta is at high risk of saltwater intrusion from prolonged flooding events associated with storm surge inundation and sea level rise. The mature freshwater forested wetlands are vulnerable to permanent loss due to potential tree mortality and introduction of invasive or nuisance species. Protection of the delta is paramount to retain the function and value of this unique habitat and the contribution it provides to nearby rural communities and large urban centers. Finally, the Blakely State Park, PEA, is located on the eastern perimeter of the Mobile-Tensaw River Delta. It has high cultural significance with pre-Civil War town ruins and historic battlefield. The state park offers eco-restoration and educational opportunities, and it abuts the Blakely Rivers, which is one of the 5 rivers composing the delta. The park is at high risk from flooding and saltwater intrusion by the inundation hazard. The site has experienced significant hurricane and storm damage as recently as 2020. Protection and continued conservation management of this priority environmental area is imperative. Back to you, Christina.
Okay. I'm not sure if we're going to be doing Any questions at this time? I think we're done with the Geo portal for now.
I'll put it back to the presentation one moment.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to briefly discuss applications for these various products. We had this question earlier in the presentation. So the methodology and findings from the environmental technical report supported recommendations in the SACS state and territory appendices. So I'm going to be talking about a couple of those recommendations on the next slide. Actions and measures for the priority environmental areas were developed that overlap SACS focus areas. I know we're throwing a lot of terms out at you, focus area, planning reaches, priority environmental areas. I'm not sure if these different terms are located on our webpage or not, but I do know that we have defined and provided a figure to see the difference between all these areas in our SACS main report. But maybe that's something we can put on our webpage at some point. But we do have focus area action strategies, and a lot of these priority environmental areas overlap the focus areas. So we do have some potential actions or measures recommended for those priority environmental areas located within SACS focus areas. Stakeholders can use these environmental products to kind of focus their efforts. But I do kind of want to emphasize that given the broad geographic coverage of this product, they are intended to be used as planning or screening level evaluations. Additional detailed analyses must be conducted to develop, site-specific conditions. Next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight a few example draft recommendations that cover priority environmental areas and environmental resources at risk. As I mentioned previously, these recommendations are included in the SACS state and territory appendices. So the first draft recommendation shown here is in Christiansted in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The recommendation is to identify and conserve parcels of land to accommodate mangrove migration. Conservation of existing coastal lands will reduce future damages from coastal storms while benefiting the natural ecosystem. Another draft recommendation is kind of on the same lines as the first one, to preserve habitat in the Tensas River Delta located in Mobile, Alabama. That's to facilitate freshwater wetland migration. So you can see here in the figure on the left, this is a snapshot of the environmental resources risk map, that a lot of the natural area in the natural areas in the Tensas River Delta is at high risk to storm surge, inundation, and sea level rise. And as Kat mentioned earlier, this area is also identified as a priority environmental area. Another draft recommendation is for the Corps to conduct a comprehensive study for the purpose of ecosystem restoration on Masonboro Island, North Carolina. Masonboro provides critical habitat to a variety of species, as well as natural protective services to mainland infrastructure directly behind the island. So the figure on the right, it's kind of hard to see, but the beaches there were shown to be at high risk. And this island was also identified as a priority environmental area. Lastly, another draft recommendation is for the beneficial use of dredge material to reduce coastal storm damage in priority environmental areas in the state of Florida. It is recommended that stakeholder coordination and collaboration in future efforts should evaluate the potential for thin layer placement, beach and dune nourishment, island creation, and other beneficial use methods in the priority environmental areas in Florida. Next slide, please. All right, back to Pam.
Okay, thanks, Christina. I'm just going to give a real quick update on what's around the corner for us. I know we've got a lot of good questions in the chat, and I think we've got almost 15 minutes to be able to move into Q&A and try to take some of those on. So from that standpoint, I do want to say thank you to Christina and the environmental team for all the work that's been done so far on this environmental analysis and on the environmental tech report, to Trevor as well and his folks relative to the geotechnical GIS support, geospatial support for this effort. Just to summarize again what's up for us as we move deeper into this calendar year, I just want to reiterate Lisa Clark's earlier request for relevant photos that we can leverage in our report product. So we're asking for those within the next few weeks. So if you please, any images that you think can help us, that you've got permissions for, please go ahead and get those in. We would be very appreciative. Coastal hazard system, again, the updated wave and water level statistics are going to be published next week for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So those updated statistics are going to be available for everybody to enhance planning and design efforts for coastal projects, followed by publication of the coastal hazard system data for the South Atlantic Basin in June, and for the Gulf of Mexico in August. And again, July, we're going to be having a quarterly update. Our next webinar will focus and highlight on the coastal hazard system itself. As I mentioned earlier, our team is going to be working hard to refine and revise the draft main report appendices in anticipation of a big internal milestone that we have coming up in August, which we anticipate getting approvals to move forward with issuance of the draft report for you all to look at in this coming October. And again, the environmental technical report should be posted in July, although you can get to much of this information currently through the GeoPortal. So with that, Christina and Lindsay, I'm going to turn it back to you so we can get into the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Pam. And one question from our attendees was, and comment was, that this is a lot of great information and a lot to take in right now. So I do want to just remind everyone that there will be a recording of this that people can view after it'll be posted to the SACS website. So if there's anything you need to go back and listen to again, it'll be there for you. And then we did have a question about the use of 3 feet of sea level rise and whether that's considered low, medium, or high probability. And so our GIS lead responded that the 3 feet of sea level rise corresponds to the USACE medium curve for a 100-year projection. It also corresponds to the USACE high curve for a 50-year projection. And then we had some questions about the priority environmental areas, one of which being if it's possible to add new ones to that now. Is it still similar to the sand question? Can something be suggested as a priority environmental area at this point?
I'm going to say it's kind of on the same lines as the sand report, because a lot of our environmental technical report is going through a review right now. I don't know, Pam, if you want to kind of join in on that, but that's my thought.
Absolutely, Christina. So you're right. Our technical reports are currently in the process of being finalized, but what has not been finalized and what will not be finalized for quite some time are the overall SACS recommendations. So again, if you've got some suggestions or thoughts regarding priority environmental areas, I'm going to ask and encourage you to provide Christina with that information, and we can get that information reflected in the overall SACS recommendations if it's not included in the actual technical report itself. And we may be able to, Christina, we may have a little bit of time on that. Sand is already finished and posted. So we may have an opportunity to integrate that into the report. But notwithstanding, we certainly can take that information and that feedback and ensure it's reflected in the overall recommendations that show up in the SAC's main report and in the appendices. Because those are going to be going through many rounds of revision and update. And then, of course, after public review, we're going to be making changes as we prepare the final. So I'm going to say it's never too late in that regard.
Thank you, Pam. Along those similar lines, we had a question about whether the priority environmental areas prioritize areas that are federally owned, and if there were ways to be more inclusive of state parks and lands owned by conservation NGOs or other conservation easements, private ownership, and how or if those were incorporated, and maybe that is a recommendation. Christina, I don't know if you want to take it.
Yeah, so no, we did not prioritize federal lands. We do have land that is state parks owned by the state. We have, I believe we have NGO land. We have all types of land that are encompass the priority environmental areas. So like Kat said, we took into account, are the areas at medium to high risk? Is a portion of the area at medium to high risk? Do they support the priority biological resources such as endangered, threatened species, things like that? Do they provide ecosystem services? And are they priorities for others? So that was kind of the filters we used to identify the priority environmental areas. And we do have all kind of land represented for the priority environmental areas, just not federal land. Not only federal land, I should say.
Can I add a comment in here? Okay, so there's a couple of examples I'd like to point out that they're not mapped or anything, they're just coming off the top of my head. But in Mississippi, we have building off of the Mississippi Coastal Improvement Program, which was an outgrowth of monies from Hurricane Katrina, 15 years ago. There, in that program, during that study phase, there were a lot of projects that were found potential, but were not necessarily authorized, or if they were authorized, some of them were not funded. And so a couple of the PEAs, or priority environmental areas, that were chosen for Mississippi are out of that growth. They grew out of that unfunded project list. And one of them is like the Forest Heights levees. Forest Heights is a neighborhood in Gulfport that has a lot of environmental justice and cultural significance because it was a predominantly African-American neighborhood that was pushed forth for coming into existence for development by women involved with the NAACP back in the 1960s. Since then, it has had a lot of issues with flooding, hence the reason for levy. But it was identified during the MISA phase, but was not funded. It was actually authorized, but not funded. So it became a PEA for SACs because of that it has the environmental justice, it has the cultural background to it. It doesn't really support much for endangered species or anything, but it doesn't have to be a PEA. So that's just an example, because those are homes that are owned individually by private parties. The levy system would be a partnership having to do with local government and state government, as well as on the federal level and possibly an NGO like NAACP. So there's an example for you that kind of goes a little bit, deviates away from the usual, forested Palustrian National Wildlife Refuge that you would find, pretty much across the northern Gulf of Mexico. So, and then there's a couple other ones that I could point out too, but the main point I want to make is that a lot of these PEAs have shared partnership potential. from the federal and the state governments right down to local government units, county governments, municipalities, as well as NGOs and private partnerships.
Great, thank you, Kat. We had a couple questions about, once something is designated as a priority environmental area, what does that mean? Are they treated differently than other priority environmental areas? And kind of what does it look like moving forward?
I'm just going to say that the SACS doesn't, I forget what the exact wording is. I know Kat had said it in her slide. This doesn't mean it has any special legal, we didn't assign it any special legal protection. These are simply areas for stakeholders to focus on if they're looking for somewhere to, conserve or manage for coastal storm impacts and sea level rise. These don't have any like special legal protection as far as SACS is concerned.
Thanks, Christina. A couple logistical questions. Stakeholders were wondering if the environmental technical report draft is ready for public review, and also the draft recommendations, if either of those things are available for review.
That is not yet available for public review. The environmental technical report is not yet. It is still going through an internal review at the Corps. It should be available on our website. We're thinking about July. And as far as the recommendations made in the state and territory appendices, those will be available for public review, I believe, in October, I think.
Christina, this is Pam. That's very true. But again, as the report goes through its rounds of review and revision between now and October, the district project managers, the district teams are continuing to work with partners and stakeholders to add to those recommendations, update those recommendations, refine those recommendations. So, so I know the contacts that we have on this last slide probably focus on environmental. Please go ahead and reach out to the environmental, to the person in your state, and they can provide you with more, in-process information about what recommendations have been developed so far, and talk with you about kind of some of your thoughts and your ideas, because that's exactly what the team is continuing to work on at this time. So I appreciate that question and that interest.
Thanks, Pam. We had a question about whether there's any ability to see the results with a range of values for sea level rise, or if it is just the 3 feet.
On what I just showed you on the environmental geoportal, it is just the 3 feet, and I believe that's that's all we used for our analysis. Drew or Trevor, I don't know if there are any other products that kind of go through a range of sea level rise scenarios.
Hey, Christina, this is Drew. Not necessarily environmentally tied. The only other product that has additional sea level rise scenarios that I can think of is the coastal hazard system, which we'll be talking about in July, that use present day, a more intermediate sea level change scenario, and then a high sea level change scenario. So those vary by region, but are about 2.5 to 3 feet for the intermediate, and then about 7 feet roughly for the high.
So, Christine, I also wanted to add to Drew's comments that the SAC study area covers between 60 and 65,000 shoreline miles. So when you're talking about a study area this large, looking at various permutations in sea level rise kind of is an overwhelming task. So we had to pick, Christina's team had to kind of pick a scenario and run with that. The coastal hazard system data that Drew just mentioned is just becoming available now. we'd love to be able to kind of crosswalk the CHS data with the environmental analysis. I don't know that that's going to be able to fit within the budget and study timelines. And we're hoping that maybe there's an opportunity in the future to do that, but it may not be within our 4-year timeline.
Great, thank you. And it looks like we are a little bit over time. I'm just gonna, there's one last question, or rather it's more of a comment, and then we can move to the contacts slide. This one was a recommendation, or if polystyrene systems are highly vulnerable and high risk, one suggestion for a recommendation for the east coast of Florida would be to protect in the inland coastal floodplain riverine environments. So we will add that in as a comment. And I think that's all of our questions. And I will move to the next slide.
All right, so I would just like to thank everybody for attending today's webinar and listening about our environmental, SACS environmental analysis. I hope you got a lot out of this webinar. And this webinar will be posted on the SACS website if you guys want to listen to it again. So here is the contact information for the SACS Command Center team, as well as the district project managers and the environmental team. So like Pam said, if you want to discuss recommendations, you can reach out to one of the district project managers or the environmental team members. So again, I would like to thank everybody for attending today's webinar. And here is our SACS webpage link. And then if you have any other questions, you can also email the SACS email address here under outreach. So again, thank you everyone for attending our webinar, and have a good afternoon.